Kia ora tātou, nau mai, haere mai. Welcome to our council meeting of Wednesday, the 1st of December 2021. Welcome to councillors, staff, and any members of the public listening. So look, as per norm, this meeting is being recorded and live streamed on the council's YouTube channel. Obviously our COVID restrictions are in place, so I don't need to go through those in detail. Our health and safety procedures are on screen. Obviously our fire and emergency exits in terms of health and safety. It is a non-smoking facility. Unlike the event of a defibrillator, it is located in front of a house, the ground floor. Obviously any incidents, please report them to the committee administrator. Councillors, just remind you, if you could, and speakers, presenters, if you could just speak clearly and use your microphone, please. Right, we'll get to our order of business, and we have first there on the agenda is apologies, and I don't have any apologies. Right. No late items. Any late items from the floor? I haven't been. No. Excellent. Declarations of interest, if any. Again, I haven't been notified of anything. All right. Moving along fine. Confirmation of minutes. The council resolves that the minutes of the council meeting of the 3rd of November 2021 public be confirmed as a true and correct record. That's on page 7 of your papers, councillors. I'll look to move it. Seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Any matters arising? There being none, I'll ask you to vote, please. That has passed, 16 votes for and none against. Thank you. Right, moving through to reports. Number 5 is adoption of the Elected Members Code of Conduct 2021. There's a memo on page 15 from our Governance Manager, Hannah.
Te Mārie, Mr Mayor, councillors. I'm glad to present what I believe has been a thorough review of this piece of governance policy, the Code of Conduct. I am grateful to my colleague Sarah Claridge for the work that she's done on this as Democracy and Governance Advisor, so potentially she might have to jump from the computer over there if there are any detailed questions. But as a general overview, you'll be aware that the Code is one of the governance policies required under the Local Government Act. It's a tool to promote the credibility and the accountability of elected members and to ensure effective governance and cohesion. The memo before you outlines the proposed changes that are there in attachment 1 as the new policy. You'll be aware it's based on the Local Government New Zealand Model Code, which was significantly updated in 2019. And it does incorporate Palmerston North City Council's procedure for the resolution of breaches with suggested modifications. Of particular interest is sections 3.3 and 3.4 and also section 5. I also actually would like to recommend that we add an additional recommendation, which is just for minor edits. I noticed this morning, my apologies, that in Appendix 9 there's a reference to the older version of the Privacy Act, so there may be other simple changes that need to be made. Also aware that the Local Government Pecuniary Interests Register Bill is currently before Select Committee, and I'm expecting that that will come into play in the next calendar year, and so that would need to be incorporated into this document when it was. So that reference to minor edits, I would hope would cover that. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Hannah. There are a few. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Thank you, Hannah, for the report. Yep, as you said, my interests are in 3.3. And there are two elements there where elected members made suggestions which officers have decided not to include the changes. And in the second, 3.3.2, you do explain the points raised by members, that members consider it inappropriate for the Chief Executive to receive a complaint. But in 3.3.1, you haven't covered the reasons why elected members wanted that removed, and I wondered if you could speak to that, please.
Sorry, microphone. I can certainly speak to why officers are recommending what we are, but the reference to elected members' position, I don't think I could fairly give that justice.
But you sought, I mean, I could speak to my own position, but I'm not the only one here, that you sought feedback from elected members. Elected members said they wanted to remove the requirement. So, but you're not able to summarise the feedback from members on that point?
So that was the feedback I received, that members wanted to remove the requirement.
And they didn't give any reasons for that?
I did not receive the reasons, no.
Thank you, I'll leave that there.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Thanks, Hannah. I just have two questions. The first one is on 5.6. So with the officer recommendation around, I guess, Table 1 becoming a bit complicated, and to simplify that by sending all preliminary investigations to an external investigator, is there, I guess, is there a risk that we would lose an informal investigation element to that, or do you still see that an external investigator could do an informal investigation and determine whether that warranted a full investigation?
Through you, Mr Mayor, that's the second stage of the process, and my apologies, members, it was my intention to bring you a flowchart so you could see this, and it's almost ready, but not quite. That the first step is still the informal process, so that there would be, that informal process is not being removed by this, that the investigation is the second stage. So we're still intending to keep it in-house at that first stage and keep that informal.
That's fine. I misinterpreted. I thought those were two separate avenues rather than actually a flow. So then my second question was on 5.7, the list of possible external investigators with relevant experience. What would be deemed relevant in this situation? Is it around experience, qualifications? Are you able to expand on that a little bit?
I am. There have been recent changes in the employment space, and particularly in 2010 there was a piece of legislation called Private Security Personnel and Private Investigators Act, and that sets out a public register of investigators. So we would need someone who was either on that list, which is held by the Minister of Justice, or the other option under the Act is that someone is accredited in the case of a lawyer.
Okay, so it's not actually about calling expressions of interest through the newspaper and seeing who
we could
who in the
certainly
community
advertise
is
for it,
interested.
but those that would apply would have to have that
Sure,
accreditation.
okay. Thank you.
Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Mr Chair, and thanks, Hannah, over here. Look, I'm just clarity, just in terms of that flow chart, in terms of process, I just want to confirm that that's actually going to be added later.
Yes, as that's not an addition of content, it's just the same content presented another way. It was my intention that would be included.
Great, thanks. Just want to tidy that up. Thanks, Mr Chair.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. I'm a bit confused by this report, Hannah, so maybe you can help me understand it. In recommendation 2, where it talks about assigning a panel of independent persons to hear a code of conduct complaint, how is that reconciled with point 3.2.4, full council to determine code of conduct complaints.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the hearing of the complaint is held by the independent panel, and that panel makes a recommendation to council that then makes the decision.
I don't believe that that's what we decided in the well, not decided, that's what we discussed in the workshop would be our preference. My recollection is that we wanted the complaint to be heard by the full council because we talked about having a jury of our peers. Is that not what you recall?
I might just need to have a conversation. I won't be long. Yes, Sarah's just confirmed that the deliberation is still by the full council on the report that is given by the hearing panel. So the decision is made by the peers of the council.
Okay. Again, I can't speak for other people. I just, that doesn't reflect my understanding of where we came to in the workshop. There's another question that I have around that second recommendation, and it's the wording of the independent investigator. So further down in your table on 5.6, where you talk about independent legal counsel, those are different people, presumably, are they?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, okay. All right, thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thanks, Hannah, for the report. A couple questions. The first one, I'd like to start just around section 12, which I think is page 30 of our papers, which is under the heading Disqualification of Members from Office. Just a couple points to clarify in there. The first one is it speaks about bankruptcy. Does that result in disqualification?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I can understand, Councillor, why you're asking me this question because it's under the heading of disqualification. But no, the request, that the statement is not that someone would be disqualified, but that they would need to notify the Chief Executive.
So given that we might enable minor amendments, this could find a different part of the document to live in?
Yes.
Thank you. Also wanted to understand in the 3 dot points there, the middle one talks about breaching the provisions or being convicted. And I just wanted to know how a breach might be determined, given that it is separated by an or, so it implies that it's not a judicial process that would determine a breach.
Again, I can see that the English is confusing. So the intention of the sentence, and I'm just trying to get this clear in my own head, is that if there was a breach of the code as determined by council, and that breach of the code was potentially also a breach of the law, then someone will be disqualified. But so it could just be a breach of the law, which doesn't need to go through the code process, that could ultimately disqualify someone, or you could go through the code process, which would ultimately bring out that there was a breach of the law, which would then disqualify a member also. That was the intent of the sentence.
Thanks for that explanation. So I guess, yeah, trying to work with this a little bit on the fly, but that to me implies an and rather than an or?
Not an and, because if it was an and, there could potentially be breaches of the code which don't disqualify a member for office. You might just require someone to apologise, or something that's not necessarily where a legal breach has happened. So disqualification from office would only happen where there was a legal breach.
Thank you. I guess what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing seem to me to be two different things, but perhaps the confusion's on my end.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I think we can work with the sentence to ensure that the sentence is referring to where legal breach has happened, regardless of whether it's post a code process, that would disqualify a member.
Okay. Sorry, you're sending me to sleep, sorry.
Sorry, a couple further questions. I'll try not to leave such long pauses. Page 35, Appendix B, makes reference, I'll just try to find it myself here. Appendix B, page 35, makes reference to advocating, it's under the how should a member respond. There's some dot points there, and one of them is advocate on behalf in a limited capacity, and I just wanted to know what your understanding is of a limited capacity of advocacy.
I don't have a professional interpretation of this sentence. This is purely word for word the resolution of council.
Arising from 97 or 99, judging from the footnotes.
That's correct. And this is currently sitting word for word as an internal management policy as well. So we do apply this currently. So we thought that since it was actually applying to elected members, it was far more relevant for it to be included in the code rather than as an internal policy.
And given that it has been applied over a couple decades, there would be some examples available of what constituted limited and what didn't constitute limited?
Where this has been used is not necessarily where a member has pushed the boundaries on this, but rather where there is a council litigation process underway, we've reminded members of their responsibilities.
Thank you. Finally, just to understand around Section 11, which speaks, sorry, I don't have the page reference right in front of me. Section 11, yes, which speaks about effectively induction programs, related things. The heading of that talks about activities that are scheduled. Who would be doing that scheduling?
The Democracy and Governance team would be doing that scheduling in coordination with the Mayor's office.
Right, so in terms of determining needs in that space, how would that be done?
Needs would be determined based on another policy which is still to come, which is the review of the elected member professional development and training policy.
Right, so it's kind of a linkage then between professional development and training.
That's correct.
And that's kind of the focus of this section?
That's correct. At the moment, that policy is still under review, but the direction of travel is that there would certainly be space in that policy to develop what would be the needs of individual members rather than just the corporate needs.
Given that that's a work in progress, would there be, in your professional opinion, a case around not having this component of the code of conduct until we understood how that was going to land?
I don't see that as being necessary. This is a section that is in the Local Government New Zealand model
Thank you both, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Harper.
Hi, Hannah. Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Just a quick question on page 19 about mediation. It talks about the complaint process and about the mediator being an independent mediator. Would that person need to be qualified?
The independent mediator would be appointed, according to this policy, from the Arbitrators and Mediators Institute of New Zealand, according to their accreditation criteria.
It also says they need to be mutually agreed by both parties. So I'm just wondering whether or not there needs to be the word qualified in there, because if they're agreed by both parties, you could get somebody from anywhere. So if you could have the word qualified in there potentially.
So the policy as it stands states that it would be from, the person that was chosen and agreed by both parties would be from the Arbitrator and Mediators Institute. So that is their qualification.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And sorry to pop back in, just some follow-up questions based on other colleagues' questioning. Section 6, Hannah, that I think Councillor Barrett was just maybe didn't mention it. It appeared to me. Section 6 has a lump that is shown as an amendment, which is not in the Local Government New Zealand draft, and speaks specifically to the role of the mayor, particularly in media contact. Why do we need to have that in our code of conduct when Local Government New Zealand doesn't see a need to specify?
This is the current practice of the current council, so this is directly from your current code.
So to flip that the other way, then do you know why Local Government New Zealand doesn't think it's necessary to include that in their code of conduct? Have we asked them about that?
I haven't asked them about that, but I suspect it's because they've tried to write a code that could be applied across a myriad of different councils who have different policies in this space.
So if this is a policy, is that appropriate for our code of conduct?
Sorry, I'm not sure I've understood your question.
I'll maybe leave that one for comment, thank you. And then just to come back to the 3.3.1, I have to confess to being a little bit confused about this compulsory training. I thought I'd understood it, and then in answer to question you said about that there will be corporate compulsory training, and my understanding of your answer was individual compulsory training. And I wondered who makes that compulsory? I think you said governance makes that compulsory, and why we would want to sign up as elected members to having the governance team tell us the learning that we needed to do our jobs.
That was not the intention of my statement.
So could you explain that for me?
So there would be a formal induction corporate program, and then there would be an individual needs-based assessment for elected members who would identify what they themselves identified as their professional development priorities, and we would try to support that.
But that's not compulsory.
It was not my intention to suggest it was.
So can you point me to the bit in the code itself which talks about the compulsory element?
The words themselves are not that there would be compulsory training, but where Councillor Barrett was referencing earlier in Section 11, taking all reasonable steps to acquire the required skills and knowledge to effectively fulfil their declaration of office and contribute to the good governance of Palmerston City. And attending the post-election induction programs, which is the 2 points above that.
So I suppose that links back to saying, well, who determines all reasonable steps?
The professional development and training policy, I think, would be the space for that to be determined, what the definition of reasonable was. So that would be determined by elected members when they agreed that governance policy.
But we're going to agree the code of conduct now that says all reasonable steps, which is not yet defined. That's probably more of a comment. Don't feel like you have to answer that. Sorry, thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Thanks, Hannah. I've got some questions about the social media Appendix A. So, what's not clear to me is if this applies to social media that councillors might have in their official sort of councillor capacity with, you know, councillor on it and all the rest of it, or does this apply to all social media? So, for example, an account that doesn't identify you as a councillor and doesn't use your full name? Or are we talking about any social media, whether that indicates you're a councillor or not, whether that indicates your name or not?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the heading itself is personal use of social media, and then in the paragraph following it does refer to personal and unofficial online use. It also suggests that the persona shouldn't be a fake persona. So in that situation, you are known even in your personal social media by your public persona.
Okay, so relating then to point 7, which talks about that, are you saying that elected members under this policy wouldn't be able to have an anonymous social media account? By anonymous, I mean one that didn't identify their name and profession?
I would.
Okay, I'll have some comment to make about that later. This edition of the social media guidelines, has this come from, how can I explain this? Has this come from a desire to be like every other council, or is it in response to an issue?
So when we first went to elected members on this code, one of the first questions we asked was, should we be considering updating our bespoke policy, or should we be considering using the good practice that had been developed by Local Government New Zealand as a model code of conduct? And so this is based on that model code of conduct, so this is directly from that.
Okay, but that hasn't really answered my question. Is this included because it's part of that model, or has there been a specific decision made to include a section on social media?
Primarily because it's part of the policy, but also in the short time that I've been here, there have been several questions and queries on social media from elected members, so this is, I hope that this will go some way to helping give direction on that.
Okay, I'll just leave it there and save the rest for comment, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Dingwell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Hannah and Sarah, for this report. You mentioned earlier that we'd be looking at a review of the elected members' professional development and training policy. Do we have a professional development and training policy currently?
We do.
And in that policy, do we list the different training as being imperative and, you know, compulsory and not compulsory, et cetera, et cetera?
There's the wording prioritises the types of learning that members would be asked to consider doing. Yep.
And so is it council that decides that kind of what the difference is between the different?
It is. It's a governance policy.
Cool.
That's determined by council.
Thank you.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Hannah. Just on page 31, where it covers in 14 penalties and actions, and going into the list where it says previously material breaches, and it says the council may require one of the following. Are you following me there with that following list? When it says one of the following, I could imagine that there could be a number of the following being selected. And I just wanted to query whether one of the following was too limiting in that we'd have to choose one and not a selection. Can I get a comment on that?
I would be comfortable adding or more in the first section, so may require one or more of the following, as it does in the following paragraph with the bullets, it states one or more.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for the chance to follow up further. It's related to Councillor Johnson's social media questions, which put a new lens across that for me. Just so it's clear for me, I suppose, what I heard by way of answers, just thinking in terms of as a practical example. So this is a bit hypothetical, but if there was, let's say, a science project being run and that science project had a Facebook page, and I made a comment in the context of that science project because I had professional involvement there but didn't personally identify myself, would I then be in breach of what we are considering today?
The statement in number 7 is when commenting on matters related to council, no members may use aliases.
Right, so provided there was a great deal of clarity that the science wasn't to do with council-related matters. Thank you for that, Mr. Mayor.
All right, no more questions? Great, all right, thank you, Hannah, thank you, Sarah. Right, councillors, we have the recommendations on screen, and that one, that council adopt the elected members Code of Conduct 2021, attachment 1, that council amend the delegation manual, delegations to the CE to read. I'm not going to read them all out, but there's 3 sections there. That the report be brought to council to establish a list of independent persons to hear Code of Conduct complaints for 2022 and the following triennium, in the first instance every following triennium. That a report be brought to council to establish a list of independent investigators to review Code of Conduct complaints for 2022, the following triennium in the first instance and every following triennium. And number 5 is that the Chief Executive be delegated the authority to make minor edits. All right. I'm happy to move this. We've had a bit of discussion about it. I'll have a seconder for it. Deputy Mayor, thank you. I'll open it up for comments. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I'm not going to be supporting these recommendations. I'm not happy with the Code of Conduct in its current form. There are a number of issues raised in questions that give cause for concern. The interpretation of this code is not clear to me, and the specific areas that I'm unhappy about are the independent panel investigating the complaint before it comes to council, the introduction of compulsory training, the section on speaking to the media. We are all elected independently by voters in Palmerston North, and I really object to any code of conduct that would make it very difficult for elected members to speak to the media. We are not a corporate organisation with a management policy about who can speak to the media. We are all independently elected by voters of Palmerston North, and we need to be able to express a view if approached by media. So I'm firmly against that. I have significant concerns about the social media appendix. In particular, and it hasn't been referred to at all in the Code of Conduct, but the increasing amount of abuse and threats that elected members get through social media that have resulted, actually, in some elected members just disabling their social media accounts altogether. That, I think, is a loss to the public, because social media provides a means for which the public can interact with elected members, and elected members can interact with the public in a way that doesn't require people to book an appointment and have a formal one-to-one. It enables a quick informal comment from people. Council itself uses social media to gauge the temperature of the residents on particular issues. It's very, very difficult, I believe, to operate within the Code of Conduct requirements for social media, because they're so vague and they don't provide any protection to elected members who have been threatened or abused online. And so for all of these reasons, I will not be voting for this Code of Conduct, and I would urge you not to vote for it either.
All right, there are no other speakers, so we will...
Sorry, Mr Mayor, I thought I was in the queue. If you would take my comment, that would be...
Yeah, that's
I'm
fine.
having
A couple of others have jumped in. Away you go, Councillor.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Elected members will have gathered from the direction of my questioning that I also have some quite significant concerns about some elements of the draft in front of us. I think the majority of it, no problem at all, but my areas of concern are significant enough that I won't be supporting it at this time here. I echo Councillor Johnson's concerns, particularly around the social media, which I hadn't really picked up on until that came up through questioning. I'm sure there are others around the table who, like me, administrate community social media pages. Does that mean I can't do that, or that I would have to declare who I was every time I popped up as an administrator on a page? It's not clear to me, and without that level of clarity, I don't want to sign up to something which could put me entirely innocently in breach of our Code of Conduct. I think for me, though, the bigger point is that we are all accountable to the electors of Palmerston North, and we act collectively through our Code of Conduct to give a forum for making that accountability work, but our primary accountability is to them, and this seems to go further than any ratepayer has ever suggested that it would be necessary, in my view. So I share the concerns Councillor Johnson raised, a particular concern about the switching of words between compulsory training in this document and imperative training, which our current training policy talks about. It seems to me to be bad process to bring one without the other when we're changing terminology and creating uncertainty for elected members, and particular uncertainty around who gets to say which training is, in the new terminology, compulsory, who gets to manage elected members, because we're all elected independently. So I won't be supporting it. Thank you.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I stand just to initially pose the question, but as a comment, that I'm going to move an amendment to the question that I was aligning to have or more, rather than leave it to the minor amendments process, and deal with issue by issue, if need be, through this process. I do suggest, though, a workshop setting or informal to wordsmith this would have been better than doing it through formal council committee, where we only get a chance to speak once and have limitations on processing them one by one. But I'll write it out. It is just in 14 under penalties and actions, where it says may require one, and my addition is comma or more of the following, which was the following list at the balance of page 31, and would look for a seconder. Speaking to that, I can simply add that because I think when we're wanting to cause a penalty or an action, that any one of those might just not be enough, and a suite of those might be more appropriate.
Point of order, Mr Mayor. that has already been addressed, and it's a minor edit, and the staff member has already confirmed that it's going to be done.
Do you have
No,
a
I
second?
didn't understand that.
So-
I'll call for a seconder. I was treating it as a, because otherwise, how do we work through, just in response, what's picked up and what
So,
isn't?
councillor, before you go on much further, is there a seconder? Okay, there is a seconder, councillor Harper.
And why it's in question, I don't want to leave it to chance, because there's been questions on social media, there's been questions on appointment of the investigator and the like. And so I'm happy that we go through this formal process and give thanks to Councillor Harper for that. So otherwise, we're voting blind if we don't go through these minor amendments. This is a pretty serious document. Ideally, we don't want to use it, but when it comes into being the roadmap to deal with breaches of the code, we want to make sure it's robust. And therefore, the penalty and actions are really wet bus tickets, ultimately, in many cases. And just choosing one of them may not be enough to suggest a consequence for not showing remorse, for example, or not showing acknowledgement of the breach. So therefore, I'm happy to move forward on that. Speaking more generally, I'm also very happy to have this deferred or considered informally to go through to make sure there is a high level of acceptance around this table. I don't think this is something that should be voted in with a narrow majority. It's too important document to just have it left in that form. So those are my expressed views on this. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor, just because of the amendment you've just raised, it actually applies, I'm just getting some advice here, that it applies to number 1, the actual attachment itself. So that's what we'll be dealing with. And if you could write that out, please, and get it to the administrator. I'll go through the other elected member comments. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and firstly to acknowledge that there has been work and effort done on this by officers as well as by elected members to get us here. Unfortunately, though, I'm left in the position, like some of my colleagues, that I don't feel that it's yet where it needs to be, and I am uncertain about how best to proceed at this point. Interested in what extent we can actually correct what needs correcting through this mechanism in the chamber today versus perhaps the need to have a more comprehensive and free-flowing process to enable that, just noting, as Councillor Dennison had, that there's significant limitations around what can be achieved here. Having said those general concerns, and perhaps naively, I would like to make at least some attempts to see if we can make improvements here today. And the specific component I think that really stands out to me as being most concerning is the inclusion of Section 11, which effectively mandates learning and development activities and elevates that to a code of conduct. I mean, code of conduct is pretty much the nuclear option when you're actually dealing with what's happening in council. To me, things that are in the learning and development space are really important, but I'm not sure that they actually have a home here. And I'm furthermore not sure that they have a home here when we're in the process of also developing complementary policy around what needs to happen in that space. It is not up to the 16 of us to make a determination about who the voters are going to choose next year and how those people might want to operate vis-a-vis their professional development needs, vis-a-vis inductions, etc. Yes, we would love them to all be included. We would, absolutely, but I don't think it actually belongs here. And so, again, in hopes of making improvements to the document here, at least to the extent possible, before moving to a substantive vote, I'd like to move a recommendation that the Code of Conduct be amended to remove Section 11 and see if there might be a seconder for that. Councillor Bowen.
All right. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I certainly wasn't expecting this to go through at 100%, but I think there's been, through the opposition that's been raised already, there are some issues that need to be further explored, and so I would like to move a procedural motion that this lie on the table until a workshop can be had. And in that, I think that actually some of it is going to come down to a little bit of wordsmithing, which is what we typically try to stay out of. But I do think that in this case, with it being the code of conduct, that actually elected members should have a say on how we describe the roadmap as Councillor Dennison has outlined. And so I would call for a seconder. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Everybody. Yeah,
All right.
thank you.
There's no more discussion on that. We'll get that up as a procedural motion, and then we will vote. Okay, that around the adoption of the Elected Members Code of Conduct 2021, for the Code of Conduct to lie on the table until a workshop can be arranged. That's moved by the Deputy Mayor, seconded by myself. We will now vote, please. That has passed, 16 votes for, none against. Thank you. Right, we move to number 6, which is the council work schedule on page 45. (45, 46 and 47). So we have there, council resolves to receive its work schedule dated December 2021. I'm happy to move that, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Any comments to that? There being none. Oh, there is, sorry, there is. My apologies. Councillor Harpster.
Just a question, if I can. It's about number 1, just asking where the CEDA shareholder arrangements is at. Progress to date.
I'll just ask GM David Murphy to reply.
So we're finalising a report on that matter at the moment. It'll be coming to the 20th of December council meeting. Just a reminder, we did have a workshop on that 6-7 weeks ago as well.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to note with appreciation the release of the report redacted around the Man02 jets.
Thank you. Right, we will vote, please. Has passed, 16 votes for, none against. Right, we will now move to recommendations from various committee meetings. Number 7 is around their Arts, Culture and Heritage Committee. From the 17th of November, I ask the Chair, Councillor Bowen, to speak to those recommendations.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to move that the recommendations from the Public Arts, Culture and Heritage Committee on the 17th of November 2021 be adopted. Thank you.
Thank you. And seconder, Councillor Barrett. Thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Just a question, Mr. Mayor. Are the recommendations that are on the screen the same as the ones we've got on the order paper? I'm not saying that they're not, but because they're in a different format, I'm just double checking.
Good point. We will just double check that. I believe they are.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other comments? I mean, obviously a busy period for our cultural CCOs, AGM time, and we finished with the last one with Cassia Birch last night. So I'll ask you to vote, please. has passed 15 votes for with 1 abstention. We now move to number 8, which is around our Finance and Audit Committee recommendations from the 24th of November. I'll ask the Chair, Councillor Beattie, to speak to those recommendations, please.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I believe there's an additional recommendation, so before I move them, we need to get that up on the screen, and then I'll move them all together. So that's the notice of motion from the Aotearoa Collective for Public Transport Equities campaign recommendation that Palmerston North City Council endorse the Aotearoa Collective for Public Transport Equities nationwide campaign for free fares on public transport for people under 25 years of age, community services card holders and tertiary students. This came from the Finance and Performance meeting from last week. So that just ties up the administration for this, that's all. So I'd like to move all the recommendations from the Public Finance and Audit Committee recommendations from the 24th of November 2021 meeting and the additional recommendation.
Okay, thank you. Seconded by Councillor Naylor. Thank you. Right, we have a couple that want to speak. I'll go to you first, Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just a minor question under 82.21, point 7D on page 55, the off-road shared path network improvements program. Now, following that decision, the Chief Financial Officer said that that would need to be tidied up for the council meeting and that it would need to be specified for the this financial year's amount as we did in B. And I'm not sure if that's an oversight that hasn't been addressed or whether that is adequate as it is, but I just thought I'd ask the question.
I'll put that to officers. So we're talking around number 7D on page 55, is that right?
So the $285,000 additional borrowing is actually over a 3-year period.
Right.
And it was suggested that we would need to specify what the amount was for this current financial year.
Right. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, so, excuse me, the 285,000, so I would need to get back to you whether there's a specified amount for this specific year. However, I would envision that that would be pretty minor in the grand scheme of total budget.
So you're saying that the first year is minor and then it's...
and we'll put it into the programs for the remaining year.
Right, okay.
Can I just add to that that would be something that I would just do because it's within my delegations anyway. So Cameron's made a valid attempt to answer the question. He wasn't actually here at that last meeting, so Stuart was, and unfortunately he's not in this morning. So, but I can take that away. We'll tidy that up, but it will be done so within my delegations. So,
thank you.
All right, Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just to request a separation on the Victoria Esplanade Hospitality Review of 78-21(3) for the vote, and not to extend my comments why, but repeating the highlighted points of our committee meeting last week that I believe we should be negotiating with the current tenant of the cafe in Goodwill without predetermining the additional licence of the mobile vendors. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Okay, we'll just give the staff a little bit of time to separate out the first clause, which is 78-21, and we can take the others together, including the new one. So we're taking, as the member requested, clause 78-21 separately. It's the first one, clause 78-21. Victoria Esplanade. Okay, there are no further comments. We will now vote on the first one. And that has passed 12 votes, 12 votes for, 4 against. Okay, now we're going to the remainder. That has passed 16 votes for, none against. Councillors, that's part one, public of our meeting done. Before we move into part two, I think we'll take a recess for 15 minutes. Okay, we do need to move that we resolve to move into part two. So council resolves public be excluded. I'll look to move that, seconded by the Deputy Mayor, and we will vote, please. And that has passed 16 votes for, none against. Thank you. All right, we'll be back in the chamber at 20 past.